Welcome in to the Play-by-Play, a sports media talk show from Awful Announcing, where we hope to provide a beautiful alternative to the growing world of sports media podcasts. I'm Brendon, Kleen, a staff writer at Awful Announcing. Over there is Ben Axelrod, the LaShawn McCoy to my Emmanuel Acho, and a senior editor at Awful Announcing. Ben, we're back. It's episode 2. We have a lot more to talk about than we did last week, which was our debut week, and the sports media gods didn't bother to drop that much news for us. This week, I think, will be much, much more. Football's back. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I think our audio is a little better. I think we were a little separated on the levels last week, but I think our audio is better. So hopefully that's more enjoyable for the listeners. And they brought us back for episode 2 against all odds. So here we are. And like you said,
that's a different FS1 show. We're not talking about that one today.
Very FS1 heavy show.
Yeah, somehow they keep doing that to us. Premiere of Breakfast Ball on FS1 this week. We'll give our first thoughts on. It's only 2 episodes, we'll be careful here, but as well as an entire lineup revamp over on FS1, Ben, where it broke right before we recorded last week. So we'll dive into all of that. Deion Sanders getting into it with multiple media members, but most recently a columnist at the Denver Post, who has now been banned from asking questions at all, and the debut of Nick Saban on College GameDay, live from the United Kingdom, and Kirk Herbstreit maybe being a villain, maybe not liking being a villain quite so much. We'll get into all of it, but let's start with Breakfast Ball, Ben. A interesting name for a TV show, as is The Facility, which will be its successor in the morning lineup in the not too distant future, starting next week. But this is the revamped Carton Show. But my initial thoughts are it's a lot less Carton. Mark Schlereth, a very late addition to this mix, and then Danny Parkins, who we thought was going to be partnered up with Emmanuel Acho. That's our trio for Breakfast Ball every morning, early morning on FS1. They've done 2 episodes, Monday, Tuesday, before we recorded this. What are your thoughts on this lineup of panelists and the show overall?
I'm sorry, did you say less Carton? Because I was watching that show and it was a lot of Carton. It felt like Carton with small snippets of Mark Schlereth and Danny Parkins, especially Danny Parkins. That was my biggest takeaway is FS1, made the splashy hire. Danny Parkins is kind of the crown prince of up and coming sports talk radio personalities. Definitely the local host who is poised to go national, has the blessing of Colin Cowherd and Nick Wright, and is kind of viewed as the heir apparent to those guys. And then I'm watching the debut episode of Breakfast Ball, which oddly enough debuted at 12 p.m. Eastern time. And we'll be moving to 9 a.m. Yeah, lunch ball, mid-afternoon snack ball. And I timed it out. It took 4 minutes for Danny Parkins to say anything of substance, which, 4 minutes on a show with 3 people might not sound like a lot. It was like they were kind of joking about the fact that he was just sitting there. It was really kind of odd. And then the other thing that stood out to me is the show is, and again, it can take time for these shows to develop. It takes time for chemistry to develop, all of that. It's a very miscast show. I do not know why Mark Schlereth is in the middle quarterbacking the show and being the de facto driver when you have 2 personalities in Danny Parkins and Craig Carton who have extensive experience doing just that. It was a lot of shouting. It was a lot of just general. It felt like an FS1 show, and I don't mean that in the best of ways.
Yeah, there is still plenty of Craig Carton to go around on this show, of course. But I think that idea of Schlereth somehow sliding in there to become the de facto anchor of it is the part that shocked me. And Brandon Contes at our site wrote a quick reaction to it yesterday, and a lot of his takeaways were the same. It just every single thing about this show, from the name of it, which obviously right now is a little bit of a misnomer, but just in general feels a little goofy. It just feels a little bit silly. To the lack of chemistry, to honestly all the news that led into this. Like, I'm watching this show thinking, not only would Michelle Beadle have been a much better third for a show like this, even if the scary reality that FS1 clearly doesn't want to embrace here of not having a former athlete anywhere on the show. I know that that's dangerous. Still would have been better. And not only her, but I think David Jacoby, who was kind of the number 2 to Carton in the previous iteration of this show that went away like a month ago, even that would have been better, because I think it suits what Carton and Parkins are good at, which is like, yeah, they have sports opinions. They're diehard fans. They've been doing this a long time, but they're goofballs. You know what I mean? They're radio guys. They're used to just shooting the you know what, and just kind of having fun. And I also think that if you're going to embrace like the early morning of it all, and that's kind of what you want. I don't need to be yelled at and hard-hitting takes and news first thing in the morning, especially where I'm at. If I'm ever going to be tuning into this show in the middle of the night here in Phoenix, Ben, I'm definitely not wanting what Mark Schlereth brings. So it is just a strange mix that makes me feel like, whether it's Beadle backing out at the last second or whatever happened there, all the dominoes that led here, you can feel that this is a hastily put together thing. And that sucks because, you know, like you said, Parkins was supposed to be this big triumphant arrival. It just feels like kind of an afterthought right now.
Well, and you and I did test episodes leading into last week's first episode of this show. And that the first episode of Breakfast Ball felt like a test episode to me. Like, it felt like they were doing a dry rehearsal. The problem was it was on national television. I think that the chemistry aspect of it is interesting because, one, I thought there actually was like a sliver of chemistry between Mark Schlereth and Danny Parkins. Like, I could actually see those two forming almost like a Costco brand Mike and Mike, where it's, you know, the nuanced sports media nerd and the ex-jock, and, you know, Mark Schlereth is saying you got to put your hand in the dirt and man 101, and Danny Parkins is saying, you know, well, actually DVOA tells us that the Kansas City Chiefs pass at a higher passer rate of expectation than the Buffalo Bills, and so on and so forth. But and that came during actually a conversation about Schlereth's Denver Broncos, where Schlereth just wanted to talk about O-line play. And he said something to the effect of like, it's time to talk about real football. Let's talk about the line play. And Danny Parkins matched him and like named 3 Denver Broncos offensive linemen. I'm a pretty like diehard NFL fan. I can probably only name 1 Denver Broncos offensive lineman off the top of my head. So like, Danny Parkins is clearly researched, clearly does, you know, his homework. And I think there's something in there, right? But to me, like, pairing him with 2 guys who are just shouting and yelling, it felt like you were sitting at a lunch table where it was probably like Danny Parkins was playing the role of me or you. And then it was like the 2 like football linemen just shouting and yelling and getting ready to shove him in a locker. So I just thought it was a really disjointed experience. But you touched on something about Michelle Beadle, because she had been heavily linked to specifically Craig Carton. What happened there? Yeah. Like, we ran the story based on reporting, I think, from the New York Post, and like the New York Post typically doesn't miss on these type of stories. Where's Michelle Beadle? What happened?
I don't know. I mean, Ryan Glasspiegel, who broke the Beadle thing and then ended up breaking the kind of finalization of this whole lineup about a couple weeks later, he said cold feet. Both sides got cold feet at the 11th hour or something, which is a double metaphor that signals to me that no one knows what the hell happened here, right? Like, I just think, I don't know. But I think like they have, Beadle and Carton have a relationship. That was part of why this whole thing started to come together. Cody Decker, who I believe still does a radio show for Mad Dog with Beadle, used to be with Carton. So there was all sorts of reasons why the connections made some sense here. And I think that type of tone would have fit Carton. Like, I know he had some, you know, like going at it, jokester, like prankster to the stuffy, you know, former athlete guy chemistry with Boomer Esiason for so long. But it just feels like in this show, Carton kept wanting, he's going to bark about his, you know, thoughts on the NFL, but like, he also seemed to want to kind of bring some levity, because like, Parkins can be a goofball, but like you said, he's also very well researched, very much in the Nick Wright mold of trying to bring the most different elements and layers to every single argument that he makes. And Beadle would have been another thing to kind of just break the ice and chill everything out. And I think that it made a lot of sense. I don't know what happened. I also, like I said, I don't really know why they didn't just keep Dave Jacoby, because I think he would have done something a little bit similar. Maybe he's a little out of his depth being one of the main people on a big studio show, given that his only real experience is doing radio with Jalen Rose for all those years at ESPN in terms of on air. But I just want something a little lighter. And Mark Schlereth, Mike Golick is a perfect comparison to him, because every time you can tell he's doing a bit that would have been media trained for an athlete coming out of the NFL in 1995. Here is what they're thinking in the locker room. It's like he has to clear his throat with something like that every single time. And it's like, it's just not new anymore. I'm not dying to hear what a former NFL player has to say about it, because they're everywhere. Let's bring something a little bit fresh. And is it just that Mark Schlereth lived in New York and had the availability and I'll take the extra paycheck until you actually figure out what this show is going to be next summer?
And the other thing that stood out is it was an hour-long show, which to me is way too long for a show without a rotating cast. Like, to me, like, Get Up is essentially 2 hours, but they cycle in analysts. They talk to different people. It feels like a different show, even though the first hour and the second hour are essentially repeats of each other. Like, they find a way to freshen it up. First Take, same thing. Like, they will bring in different people to debate with whoever's on the show that day. 1 hour of 3 people screaming at each other is a lot. The same 3 people screaming at each other. Yeah. That's a lot. And they only talked about the NFL, which I understand is realistic for this time of year, especially coming up here in a couple of weeks. But what's this show going to look like in March? What's this show going to look like in...
The logo has a football in it. They're not going to talk about anything else. That's the crazy part of this too.
Well, so do we think that had maybe something to do with Michelle Beadle, like, not being a part of it? Because Michelle Beadle essentially left ESPN and Get Up, right? Because not because, but in part because she was done with the NFL. Like, she swore off the NFL, following some of her more recent work. Like, she still talks about the NFL, but I don't know if she wants to be talking about the NFL for 5 hours a week. Like, and so to me, my first thought is it's the money, right? Like, just follow the money. Like, there must've been something that popped up. But then my second thought is, like, if there was some sort of creative difference, I can't imagine Michelle Beadle wanted to be a part of a show that only talked about the NFL all the time.
No, I doubt it. And I think that brings us to the next show, which will debut next week, but it is called The Facility, also very much referential to the NFL, and only features NFL players, former, on its panel here. So that is where Emmanuel Acho ended up heading without Danny Parkins, who was long reported to be his partner, LaShawn McCoy, who was with Acho on Speak up until this week, James Jones, who was... The way that they would always introduce him was that he was not technically a featured part of that show, but he might as well have been. And then Chase Daniel, who obviously you shouted out in our test episode on the new Scoop City podcast with Diana Rossini at The Athletic, and much more analytical than I think you would have expected to be a new FS1 talk show panelist. But here he is. I think that this goes back to... There were always like these rumblings, Ben, of Skip Bayless, the fact that it wasn't just all of us who were aghast that he couldn't stop talking about the Lakers and LeBron and these minute topics around the NBA that may or may not have been relevant. There was always, like, you would see some report at the very end of a story about Skip of, like, FS1 doesn't love that he talks so much about basketball and these other things. This is just them saying every morning you're getting several hours of only football. And I can almost appreciate that they're just done pretending.
Yeah, and you know what? I actually have a take about this. And to me, it's the NFL's rise in popularity, in my mind, happened in the early 2000s. And I don't think it happened by coincidence that was around the same time that shows like Around the Horn and PTI were really taking off. And we had kind of this sports talk renaissance on television. And to me, the NFL is just so perfectly suited for sports talk television. It's one game a week, so you can place heavy importance on every game. The transactions carry you through the offseason. It's quarterback controversies, it's coaches, it's who screwed up, it's who's the face of the league. It lends itself to such natural conversations in ways that the NBA doesn't, and especially baseball doesn't. Baseball used to be America's pastime, and now, like, you can't talk about baseball on television because how can you place importance on 1 out of 162 games? Like, the equivalent of one game in the NFL to baseball, I think, is like 17 and a half games. Like, it just doesn't work on shows like PTI and Around the Horn. And now this brings us, here to where FS1 is putting together this lineup that's only focused on football. Like, they're done playing the game of let's give baseball their turn, let's give basketball their turn, let's sprinkle in some hockey or whatever else. Like, this is all football and generally NFL all the time. And I'm sure they have, maybe I'm giving them too much credit. I'm sure they have numbers or metrics that indicate that's their best chance for success. But it's you're right. It's just kind of like jarring to not even like be putting up the pretenses that you care about anything else.
Yeah, what's odd to me is that Fox FS1, let's call it, ignores college football so much. That's the part of it. And like, people have criticized ESPN for this, but obviously there's still places at ESPN where you can get that if you wanted. And then, there's so much game happening on ESPN that they'd almost be silly not to. Like, it shows up. On FS1, it's like, I don't know if I've ever heard Nick Wright give a college football take in my life.
Yeah, is he a Missouri fan? I don't even know like where his allegiance is.
No clue, right? And like, obviously all these NFL guys went to college, like they have a familiarity, but I don't get the impression that that's going to be what's discussed. Yet on Saturday, a lot of people watch college football on Fox. It's an odd collision, but this kind of brings me to the rest of this lineup. So the herd is going to stay. First things first will stay. It's 2 hours now, as is Speak, where Joy Taylor will be partnered up with the old undisputed hangers-on in Keyshawn Johnson and Paul Pierce. That show, the revamped version of it, will also debut next week, along with the facility and breakfast ball in its correct slot. But especially with the herd and First Things First, I think that in terms of going viral, outperforming their kind of time slot, and just general awareness in the fact of Colin Cowherd and Nick Wright being probably the two most, especially with Skip Bayless gone, kind of recognizable faces of this network. The rest of this lineup looks nothing like those two shows. And I think it goes back to Parkins, where I think a lot of us looked at it and said, okay, Colin Cowherd, Nick Wright, they have a formula. What are they going to do with it? And even Joy Taylor came from local radio. Mm-hmm. How are they going to keep building that type of a show? And it's like their instincts can't help but get in the way of what the numbers and the audience is telling them works. Like, they're just so infatuated with, let's get the big former NFL dudes on the screen and let them talk about stuff. That's all they want to do, even when everything is yelling at them to go the opposite direction.
Yeah, Joy Taylor's the one, like, I'm shocked FS1 hasn't been able to figure out. And frankly, I'm like kind of surprised she's still there on her own accord, because she's a real talent. And I've been listening to her dating back to her days at 790 The Ticket. And to see her go to FS1 and basically just be used in this kind of moderator role, and it just seems to be interchangeable ex-athletes flanking her. Like, I just think she's so much more talented than that. I know that's something Dan Lebitard has hit on his show. To me, like, she is a star, and she is somebody who should be the cornerstone of your morning lineup and really what you're trying to build moving forward. And this show she has coming up with Paul Pierce and Keyshawn Johnson, it just kind of seems like, hey, we still have these two guys under contract. We hired them to be with Skip Bayless. Instead, we're going to put them with Joy Taylor. I don't know, man. I think that's kind of a failing mission. I don't know how that show is going to succeed. I think it just has too many ties to Undisputed, and I think Undisputed is such a damaged brand.
Yeah, I think all of this feels very half-baked, if I'm being honest with you. It was one thing up until the last moment, and it ended up being very, very different. I think that we talked about this in our test show as well when we were breaking down the first reports about all this, and I still believe it to be true, maybe even more so now. I think that FS1 knows that they have some significant negotiations to get to when it comes to Colin Cowherd looming, and they're
Mhm.
not willing to make any big moves in any direction until they know what that's going to look like. If they don't have the herd in the middle of all of this, like the existence of FS1 becomes a very big open question, right? So I get it, and I guess I understand not wanting to sort everything out permanently until then. They already had Skip leave and Shannon before that. And if Cowherd were to leave or change anything about his arrangement, they would be in for it as well. So maybe this is just a 1 year experiment. We'll see which shows click. I have a feeling it may just be the herd and first things first. There's parts of this, Parkins, Chase Daniel, what does Acho look like as a full on kind of anchor and host that I'm interested to see. But a lot of it feels like we could just be talking about more change next year. All right, one show that has not changed much in a long time up until the past couple of years is College GameDay. Obviously, Pat McAfee ended up sticking around after rumors that he was considering his future there, and the legendary Nick Saban has joined the panel. They had their premiere this season, Ben, from Dublin ahead of Georgia Tech, Florida State. What were your thoughts on Saban and this first look at what will be every Saturday morning our college football wake up show this fall?
I think Saban's really good. I think the comparisons to Belichick are they're interesting because those two are so intertwined based on their past work together. But both legendary head coaches in college and the NFL, and now they're making the transition to media. And I think for both of them, it's pretty seamless. I thought that Saban was one of the bright spots of the first episode of College GameDay. I think that the problem for guys like Nick Saban, and this is something that Urban Meyer runs into on the Fox pregame big noon kickoff show, is they are so linked to a single university. In Nick Saban's case, it's Alabama, and in Urban's case, it's obviously Ohio State. At least what he's talking about on Fox, that there is this cloud of, like, when they're giving analysis about those programs, and it's inevitable that they will, like, what's the ulterior motive? Like you know that they have biases, that they still have ties to those programs. And so with Nick Saban, we've kind of gotten into this cute little, like, oh, he's picking against Alabama because it's giving them the rat poison and it's actually motivating them. That stuff's kind of tired to me. Like, I kind of just want to hear Nick Saban's thoughts on Alabama. Maybe that's unrealistic because he has so many ties to that program still. But I thought largely he was really good. And I think he'll continue. I think he'll be one of the bright spots moving forward.
I agree. I mean, the fact that he and I think you would say the same about Belichick, these two legends who are entering the media space together this fall. To me, it's the fact that they're even here and doing this significant of a role tells you everything you need to know about it, right? They're gonna care, they're going to take it seriously, do the prep and everything else. The one thing that I'm curious though about with Saban is with Belichick, it's very clear he wants to get back into coaching. Saban doesn't appear to want to do that. To me, it's just what is in it for him outside of the money. It's fascinating that he wouldn't just ride off into retirement or do something at the very least less intensive than traveling all around the country every week to go be part of this show. It's the premier brand in college football. Obviously, there's a status that comes with that, but it's a big undertaking for somebody who didn't really need it. And I guess I'm just, he's talked a lot already about how difficult it is to kind of be in that prediction and speculation chair, which we've heard a lot too. But I don't think it's reverse engineering motivation for Alabama would be the reason he's here. But what is just wanting to spread knowledge and info about the game that he loves? I mean, okay, great, that's fine, but he's one where he didn't need to do this. He's not a young man. He has nothing left to prove or achieve, and yet here he is. It's just going to be interesting to keep an eye on, I guess.
Yeah, I think you can never underestimate the egos of these college football head coaches, especially the ones who have found as much success as Nick Saban, which is none of them, because he is the most successful coach in college football history. And it's what's he going to do if he doesn't do this? Like
Yeah.
I'm sure he would enjoy
Disappear, which is not something that people like him like to do, right?
No, that's how they wind up being as successful as they are, because they don't want to just go sit on a beach. They don't want to just, be royalty in the press box at Tuscaloosa. They want to be out there. And he's good at it. And so it's like, if you dabble in it and you get told you're good at it, that's only going to encourage you to keep doing it and getting better at it. And he's obviously being paid very handsomely for it. There were always message board rumblings that he made like a bunch of bad real estate deals, and that's like Texas was going to come rescue him out of these bad real estate deals. And that's how they were going to hire him. I don't know if there's any legitimacy to that, but like, the money doesn't hurt. Like, and I know Nick Saban's not hurting for money, but somebody offers you, millions of dollars for a gig that's essentially 4 months out of the year. Like, I don't think you're going to turn that down if you're a guy who's already probably predispositioned to being enticed by that kind of spotlight and that kind of role like Nick Saban. So I'm never surprised when these guys don't want to disappear, because I think that's as much as they can act like they don't like the spotlight. I think it's easy to say that when you're in it. And I think when you leave the spotlight, you wind up missing the spotlight. And I think Nick Saban probably he knows he has it good. It's kind of no downside for him, right?
And he's getting the red carpet rolled out for him. You know what I mean? It's not like he's just some guy on TV. He's the guy on the show about the sport that he's ruled over for 20 years. So it's not a bad gig. What do you think of this rumor, or that's not even a rumor, this idea that people have speculated when it comes to Belichick, that he might take to this more than he thinks and end up in it for the long haul the same way that we assume Saban will be? Do you think Belichick could feel that that attention in the same way and be on our screens longer than we think?
I think that's viable. Like, that's a theory I subscribe to. Because one, I think Bill Belichick, as good as I think Nick Saban is, I think Bill Belichick's even better at it. I think the fact that he's already dipping his toes in so many different areas and already like reaching out. And I mean, he could have just been on a pregame show and we would have been like, oh my God, like Bill Belichick's on Sunday Countdown. Like, this is a big deal. Now he's doing a show with Underdog. He's doing the new Let's Go podcast, oddly enough, which was just announced. He's doing the stuff with McAfee. He's doing the stuff with Omaha. Like, this is a guy who is clearly into this and clearly interested and invested in it. And so if he is as good at it as he seems to be based on the early returns, like, who knows how that man, I mean, maybe it turns into a position where it's like the Dallas Cowboys and ESPN bidding over Bill Belichick next offseason. How about that?
We can only hope here on the play-by-play that something like that were to come to be.
I also think real quick. I also like, there's this idea that Bill Belichick's going to get a head coaching job next offseason. Bill Belichick wanted a head coaching job this offseason. So like, I don't know what would change in a year for somebody who's already in his mid 70s, like why he would be a more attractive candidate, even if he's just 1 year further removed from the stink that he left in New England. Like, I don't know. I just don't think it's a foregone conclusion that he's going to get a head coaching job next offseason.
I also just think the legend of the whole, he wants to chase the record, the all-time wins record for a coach thing has just become this like massive idea in everybody's head that it's not like he's out here talking about it constantly. And it's the kind of thing that I would think the further you get away from it and it doesn't feel so right in front of you once you're away from coaching for a bit, it's probably not as important. These guys are freaks, but look, like, they've been freaks for their whole life. I'm sure when you get into your 70s, that's not quite as tantalizing. If you have all these other things you enjoy doing, you're getting paid well, and you still get to be around it all.
And Andy Reid's going to like lap him anyways at this rate. As long as Andy Reid's coaching Patrick Mahomes, like, that is Andy Reid's record. That is not Bill Belichick's record.
Yeah. All right. Kirk Herbstreit, obviously featured prominently in the return of College GameDay as well. Ben, walk us through the day that was in Ireland for the star. Do we still call him that, of College GameDay? What do we do here? Walk us through Kirk's day.
I mean, he's really one of the cornerstones of College GameDay. That is he's been associated with it the longest since the start. This is, for all intents and purposes, Kirk Herbstreit's show. It was really, I mean, it could not have worked out any worse for Kirk Herbstreit, probably, because of everything that happened with Florida State last year. And I'm still not sure why he is the one who has been branded with all of the ear that Florida State fans have toward ESPN. He seems to be the central figure when there are a lot more personalities who have been a lot more vocal about, flat out mocking Florida State. Yeah. Kirk Herbstreit, I think, probably just stated his opinion that he thought Florida State didn't deserve to get in, or that they were less deserving to get in. And he's the one who's taking all the backlash. But I mean, it started actually on Friday with the Pat McAfee show, which was at a pub in Dublin. Ben Koo noticed that there was a guy behind the set at the McAfee show wearing a Kirk Herbstreit clown shirt, with Kirk Herbstreit's face with a clown nose on it. And he was trying to get on camera, and it seemed like the cameras were actively avoiding him. And then finally he had his 10 seconds of fame where he was front and center wearing this Kirk Herbstreit clown shirt. And that carried over into Saturday, where every time Kirk talked, he was getting booed out of the place. There were signs about him. I'm sure they were more clown t-shirts, but this was very much like a perfect storm of week 0 is this neutral site game in Dublin, Ireland, that Florida State fans are going to outnumber Georgia Tech fans 9-1. And they're just booing the hell out of Kirk Herbstreit, and they made Kirk Herbstreit the bad guy. It was actually funny. My guy Sheamus from Hot Mic last week, I shouted him out as the celebrity guest picker, the WWE superstar Sheamus. He wound up being the only one to pick Georgia Tech. And it's funny because those picks, I always think it's funny to see how, especially being at the game they're at, slants who they pick. And everyone on the panel picked Florida State. It was 90% Florida State fans. And Sheamus, who's usually a bad guy in WWE, he didn't mind picking Georgia Tech. He basically said he was picking Georgia Tech because he wanted to be the heel. Everybody booed him. Kirk Herbstreit then started playfully doing the Hulk Hogan, hand to the ear. And you could tell he was almost like he was mesmerized by this idea that somebody could lean into being the bad guy, the way Sheamus, a pro wrestler, does, because you could tell it's something just Kirk Herbstreit's never thought about before. And so I'm not fully expecting Kirk Herbstreit to come out next week with the black Hulk Hogan beard and an NWO shirt. But I really think Kirk Herbstreit's kind of at this crossroads where he has somehow, for somebody who's been for lack of a better term, a pretty vanilla presence in terms of his takes and his personality. He's really become a polarizing figure between, what he's been saying about transgender athletes and what he's been, saying on social media. And then this back and forth he has with all these fan bases. Kirk Herbstreit's really kind of at this weird crossroads that I 5 years ago, I would have never thought Kirk Herbstreit is polarizing beyond the belief that, Ohio State fans think he hates his alma mater and Michigan fans think he's a homer for him. I don't know how we got to this point.
He's just been famous for too long. I think that might be it. The Dark Knight quote, live long enough to become a villain, right? I think that's kind of where he's at. I mean, he doesn't help himself with some of the, social commentary that he's had lately. And he seems very turned into a pretzel on that stuff in terms of, weighing in on the transgender athlete thing around the time of the Paris Olympics controversy in women's boxing, and then kind of doubling down and saying, I'm tired of being, mocked, and I don't give a shit about criticism and all this stuff. And then he does an interview with Jimmy Trina on the SI Media podcast where he kind of conflates those comments about, I'm going to speak out about these issues, and ESPN I didn't hear a word from them, and I don't care what people have to say about it. I'm going to be this and that, with what I actually meant is that I was tired of people creating these conspiracy theories about me as an analyst, that I have all these allegiances that I don't have. That's what I was saying. I don't give a shit about. It's no, you weren't. That's not what you were saying. He just doesn't like being disliked. I think he just can't stomach being hated, and he doesn't have to be hated, but he's also not trying very hard not to be hated in all these different ways. So maybe this is going to just become Nick Saban being smart and famous, and then also Kirk Herbstreit dealing with this weird heel turn that he's not fully ready to embrace, but might be headed his way anyway. I don't know. You mentioned Pat McAfee briefly there and the shirt. Did you have a big issue with the Guinness chugging, drink pounding Pat McAfee that we saw wearing a hat in the back of a pub on Friday's edition of the Pat McAfee show? Is this deeply insulting to you, Ben?
Yeah, just to take the listeners behind the scenes, and that's what we want to do here on the play-by-play, is like, we had this discussion in our Slack channel, like, hey, do we like, Pat McAfee's pretty hammered, or at least he's giving the appearance of somebody who is pretty hammered. Do we want to cover this? Like, this is like, how do we cover this? And we ultimately didn't. Like, I think our sensibilities were basically like, it's Pat McAfee in a pub celebrating the start of the college football season. It would be weird if Guinness wasn't like heavily involved in this. Like, it would be weird if Pat McAfee was stone cold sober for this. So I think we stayed away from it, but I also understand, like, this is year 2 of Pat McAfee now. And so we, as a sports media website, are probably a little numb to some of Pat McAfee's antics, but I don't think it's odd that anybody would think that it's strange that,
I kind of do think it's odd that people would think it's strange at this point, right? It's like, yeah, it's been a year, and as long as like the FEC or the SEC and the Disney shareholders don't care, what do I care? What does anybody care? Are we like, it's pearl clutching, and I think that's fine, but this did not cross that line to me. You know what I mean? Like, how long ago was Howard Stern doing his insane radio broadcast where they were doing all assortment of consuming things and having colorful folks around, right? 30 years ago or whatever. Like, this is just, come on. Yeah, okay, it's ESPN. Do you own Disney stock? Unless you do, and you have some kind of major issue that this is going to blow up in everybody's face, then like, you're kind of just, I think digging a little bit. I think that people just like to find reasons to be bothered by Pat McAfee, and this did not even get close for me.
And this is what you brought Pat McAfee to ESPN for, right? Like, this was your answer to Barstool Sports. You clearly saw some portion of the demographic that you were losing to places like Barstool and in places that were less rigid than you previously were. And you're saying, hey, we're going to lease this out to Pat McAfee. And there's this whole idea that Pat McAfee has the ultimate leverage on ESPN because he's not a contracted employer, which is true. But ESPN knows that. Like, ESPN was not surprised when Pat McAfee started flexing his muscles. I mean, no pun intended, but like to do these sorts of things. Like, you can't be surprised when Pat McAfee acts like Pat McAfee, right? Like,
and they had to have cleared that he could do the show from the place that he did. Like, that didn't come as he's in Ireland on the air today. ESPN suits just shocked. Of course not. They're probably assisting in the broadcast in some way, shape, or form. They at least have to have a heads up on something like that. If it was a huge red line for them, it would never have even happened, and who knows how he would have responded. I understand they have to pick their battles, but for the most part, if I'm seeing something on ESPN airwaves during the 2 hours of the show that are on ESPN, for the most part, I'm going to assume that's been cleared by ESPN unless it crosses a significantly further line than chugging some beers.
Yeah. And there's stuff, like Pat stepping in it politically or saying, stupid things like that, which we cover. And then there's
those cross that line, right?
Right. And there's Pat McAfee wearing a tank top and getting drunk, wearing an Irish kilt, which he actually wasn't doing. That's a Scottish thing. That's not a Irish thing. A lot of people.
He was wearing the hat. That. I don't know what they're called. I don't know what the hats are called.
Yeah.
Also, I know we have another college football story to close out with here, but I got my acronym FCC. I was searching, FCC. I was pulling. I just wanted to make. I know what it's called. I just couldn't find it in the moment. There you go.
It's so many of them. It's tough to keep track. I can't fault you there.
The one that doesn't let you curse on TV. That's the one I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking college football, let's get to our final subject. And finally, what would it be kicking off the college football season without talking about Coach Prime, Deion Sanders, who is already dominating the headlines, already been written about 50 times, I think, this week on our website. Really not, I mean, he's made some headlines here and there, but all things considered, like, relatively quiet offseason for Colorado and Coach Prime. I mean, compared to what we were seeing last September, where we were writing about him on an hourly basis. But he did manage to make some headlines.
We're not quite to September yet, Ben, so we might be headed there. Just wait.
That's a good point. But he did make some headlines last week, or at least the University of Colorado did, or Colorado University, Colorado, UC Boulder made headlines when the Denver Post announced that UC Boulder had banned columnist Sean Keeler from. Now, it's not clear to me whether he's banned from attending the press conferences or just asking questions. I know he's allowed to attend games. In any event, he's effectively banned from press conferences. Sean Keeler is a columnist at the Denver Post. He has written harshly about Coach Prime, referring to him as the Bruce Lee of BS, as Deposition Dawn, referring to the state of UC football as a circus. There were some other nicknames and alliterations, but you get the gist. He's very critical of Deion Sanders, and so now UC has determined that he has crossed that line. Deion Sanders has contract language that stipulates he only has to speak with mutually agreed upon media. So you can deduct that there is no mutual agreement when it comes to speaking with Sean Keeler. What do you make of this? Is this a big deal, or is this kind of business as usual when it comes to the Buffaloes program under Coach Prime?
A little bit of business as usual. I thought that Dan Patrick had a good take on this that I wrote up for the site on Tuesday, of just that this is sort of the blowback, the backlash from all those stories you mentioned we were talking about last fall, right? Where there's just been so much hype, and yeah, he quadrupled the number of wins, but that only goes so far for a team that had one before he got there. And, they're slated to be subpar this year in terms of what the odds makers say and everything else. And yet the hype is still just as big. He's in the spotlight just as much. And that hasn't changed. So in a way, like, it is kind of the job of a columnist to take that type of person to task. However, I think the clip that has gone maybe under the radar a bit in this whole saga is Keeler asking a question recently at a press conference at what I assume was one of the final ones before that ban. And Deion said, "Hey, we'll get to your question. What's your problem? What's the deal? You're always so negative. Why?" And Keeler basically wouldn't answer, just like kind of joking around, dancing around, and wouldn't just explain at the very least, why do you keep writing negative things? Which, if you're a columnist and you're asking a human being a question, you should be able to answer, right? Oh, well, you guys underperformed last year, or you couldn't keep up the momentum from those big early season wins, and I don't know if it's going to be better this year. Whatever feels right. So I think both sides of this are in the wrong. The part of it that interests me maybe the most is the Colorado side of it, and a lot of attention has been placed on the fact that they agreed to this clause in his contract that would allow him to ban a person like Sean Keeler if he wanted to. And to me, it just kind of illustrates that, like, these programs, especially if you have as many external, earned media types of things like Deion will always have for as long as he's anywhere close to relevant in any sport that he's participating in, they don't need Sean Keeler. They don't. Yeah. They don't need press conferences, frankly, to get attention, to sell tickets, to do the things that are going to keep the program afloat. So I know that doesn't feel good, but it's kind of the truth. It's the truth of a lot more programs than just Colorado. But to me, it's just not a surprise that Deion and Colorado would be the ones to finally pull the trigger and say, yeah, we're just not going to prioritize these friendly relationships with people who we don't need to cover our team in order to be famous and popular.
I didn't see the clip you're talking about. Was Keeler's question like confrontational or negatively slanted, or was he just asking like a depth chart question?
He barely even got into the question in the clip that was going around because Deion kind of took an aside to say, "Hey, before we get to that, what's up? What's your problem with me? Let's talk it out." And Keeler just wouldn't engage.
See, so that actually answers like the biggest question I had about all of this is, so when I'm a little bit older than you, but when I was in college and going to journalism school at Ohio State years and years ago, back then, like, there were columnists and there were reporters, and there was this idea that you became a beat writer and you covered the team and, you wrote the day-to-day depth chart stories and all that. And then after a certain number of years, you had earned your right to give your opinion. But there was this idea that if you gave a strong take and that if you criticized the head coach or a player or a quarterback or whoever, like you had to show up the next day and be ready to face the wrath. And so I guess that was kind of my thing about this is if you're Deion, like, don't you want this guy at your press conferences? Don't you want him like to have to come face the music and have to like say these things he's writing about you, say them to his face, which is a lot more difficult to do. But it sounds like Deion tried that, right? Like it sounds like Deion tried to get ahead of this. And from what it sounds like you're saying, Sean Keeler kind of evaded him and didn't, was a little tougher with his writing than he was with his actual words. I think that one, like this almost feels like such a old story in the sense that like, I didn't realize we still had local columnists who held the head football coach responsible. Like to me, like granted, Ohio State's had a lot more success than Colorado has had, but the idea of any columnist questioning Ryan Day or Urban Meyer, like that's borderline unfathomable to me. But I think it's this story has produced almost like the most predictable takes from everyone. Like I was watching Get Up yesterday or on Monday, I was watching Get Up and Paul Feinbaum is taking Deion to task and calling him a bully and a hypocrite and making it sound like democracy is at risk because a football columnist is not allowed in a post-game press conference.
Mike Florio took a similar approach of big bully and this is the end of the First Amendment as we know it, and it's like no, it's just Deion being Deion.
And then conversely, Dan Orlovsky, whose experience is rooted in being a quarterback, is defending Deion and saying like, hey, at a certain point, like these figures who get this much criticism, they're allowed to stand up for themselves. To which it's like, yeah, you can, but you cannot. There are other ways to stand up to him than by just banning him outright from the press conference. Like I haven't seen a good take on this, and I'm hopefully we can give one while we ramble here. But I don't. To me, this is business as usual for Deion. I do think like the funniest side effect of all of this has been Sean Keeler getting sideswiped because I was watching Get Up and First Take while they were discussing this, and everyone went out of their way to make the point to say nobody knew who Sean Keeler was before this, and now everybody knows who Sean Keeler was. Accurate. Which is a valid point. But that's just kind of been the fun. Like nobody is necessarily, and actually a lot of people seem to agree that Sean Keeler did cross lines with some of the stuff that he's written about Deion. But I also think like just outright banning the guy, I don't think that necessarily puts Deion in the best of lights either. So my favorite kind of topic where everybody loses.
Everybody loses. I will say the one dynamic that because there was also this controversy about a month ago now, where a writer from a blog, Athlon Sports, broke this very juicy, crazy series of nuggets about this program that include hazing and bullying and things around how his sons are treated in the program versus other players, and they're emboldened to do things to the other players that are unsavory and all this stuff. And a lot of Colorado fans and kind of like fan adjacent media really came to his defense. And I think that the point you made about the columnist who's like actually going to blows with the coaches is one part of this, but there's just in a lot of these situations, not a lot of confrontational media at all. And if any part of any of it with Deion at Colorado, or obviously other things that he's faced down throughout his whole career in the public spotlight are true, then that stuff does deserve a closer eye. And maybe we're just at a point in time where that's harder and harder to come by. But I don't think the way you do it is calling somebody the Bruce Lee of BS and trying to get, some clicks. So that's probably not gonna check that box either. All right, let's go to the hot mic to close things out as we do every week. Something that Ben and I liked, disliked, found interesting, want to nerd out about from the world of sports media. Ben, kick us off.
Yeah, I'm going to go to my guy, Bill Simmons. I think it's probably the upset of the century that we are we're coming into the final 10 minutes here of our second episode, and I don't think we've talked about Bill Simmons yet. If you follow me on social media, I am a longtime follower of Bill Simmons' work. I can oftentimes be critical of the sports guy.
How long have you consumed Bill Simmons content in written, audio, or television form?
I would say since 2006.
Okay.
And this is like we will have to just do a whole Bill Simmons episode, because there's I think Bill Simmons is the most important figure in sports media in terms of the internet. I think that he is a pioneer in the blogosphere. I don't know if our site would exist without Bill Simmons. I have a lot of praise for Bill Simmons, but I also have a lot of criticism of Bill Simmons, especially at this point in his career and post ESPN. But having said all that, Bill Simmons is in a contract year. It's been reported that his deal at Spotify comes to an end in 2025. He obviously sold The Ringer to Spotify, but is still employed there. He has he's had different titles in terms of he's pretty high up in podcasting there. But he's, I think paid largely as a talent there. But he's entering a contract year, and he returned from his annual summer vacation, which, not shading him for that at all. All sports media members should take their vacations, especially before the NFL season. But he is in contract year, Bill Simmons. He came out with a 1 hour and 48-minute podcast on Friday, previewing the NFL. He came out with a nearly 3-hour podcast on Monday, doing fantasy football talk and interviewing Adam Sandler and one of the Safdie brothers. And Bill Simmons, like I said, very
and
polarizing.
Rob Schneider for about 15 minutes, which was a pleasant surprise in that episode. And I'm saying that not truthfully. It was not a pleasant. It was an unpleasant surprise.
So I actually still have an hour left in that podcast. That's how long it is. I haven't gotten to the
okay, you'll
Rob
get
Schneider
there. You'll get there.
Cameo. So you spoiled that for me. Thank you. But Bill Simmons had Chuck Klosterman on a week ago, and I really did not enjoy the podcast. I really just found it to be kind of two Gen Xers, kind of. I don't know. It seemed like they were trying to rekindle the way their podcasts used to be, and Klosterman was giving weird takes about the Olympics and how he would only draft foreign NBA players moving. It felt very forced. But Bill, to his credit, I think you could say this about Bill Simmons and Dan Le Batard, is they have made conscious efforts to surround themselves with younger people, because they know that's not only best for their media companies, but that's best for them. That keeps them engaged with a younger audience. And I think these last two Bill Simmons episodes have done a great job of that. Rob Schneider cameo notwithstanding. On Friday, he had Kyle Brandt, Sheil Capopita, whose name I probably just butchered, Stephen Ruiz, and Kevin Clark on real kind of quick hitter segments where they talked about 5 random things each from the NFL. And then this week he did the My Guy fantasy football draft with the guys from the Ringer fantasy football podcast, and really just engaging conversations, ways that they kind of showcased, Stephen Ruiz. I'll give you for an example. He's a guy I'm familiar with in the NFL Twitter sphere. I've probably argued with him about Baker Mayfield at one point. But having him on the podcast really kind of shed him in a different light from what I would have seen from him on Twitter. And I just thought good takes, good conversations, good back and forth. I thought it was just a great refresher ahead of the NFL season. So as critical as I can be of Bill Simmons, and I will probably be very critical of him here in the not too distant future, I thought that this was a pantheon week for the sports guy.
It's interesting. The Bill Simmons subreddit, which I am not ashamed to admit that I do check out periodically, they're convinced that he's actually, and Jason McIntyre tried to create this conspiracy as well, that he's kind of dogging it intentionally and putting out even less content during this dry period than normal in order to remind Spotify of his value or something like that. But I tend to agree. I think the podcast is not quite what it was at its peak. I do think that a lot of the Ringer talent that he's able to bring on does make it better. And I think Bill, at this point in time, one of his best qualities as a podcaster is that, you're right, he brings the absolute best out of his guests almost every single, no matter who it is. And he just generates good conversations. So that's still true of the show, even if maybe his own, attention to detail may have slipped, as it does with every sports media host. But yeah, I tend to agree. I don't think he's dogging it. I think that they've been pretty normal in terms of quality. All right, we'll end here quickly. We don't have to spend a lot of time on mine, but Andrew Marchand over the weekend of The Athletic put out a thought experiment for the people, basically wondering, when you look at the fact that Mina Kimes is on Rams preseason games locally in LA and Peter Schrager filled in for the final Giants preseason game locally in New York, and I guess he's done some Jets in the past few years as well. When the next time somebody in their mold would get a shot in a booth full time in a real way. And there's a whole history of it. Tony Kornheiser was the last guy to get that shot on the NFL. Obviously, Howard Cosell's an example. People point to like Tom Verducci in the baseball side. Tim Kirkjian sometimes pops up on the for ESPN in the booth. Basketball, less so. My question for you, Ben, just to get our creative juices flowing, who would you want it to be? Is there somebody that comes to mind that either has experience or maybe doesn't in the booth in any sport that you feel like that person would actually be a good successor to Kornheiser and Cosell and all the rest?
So McAfee wouldn't qualify, right? Because McAfee, like, is an ex-player.
I don't think so. Ex-player.
Yeah, I feel like he's kind of in that mold though, because he's not going to be in there telling you like, I mean, he's a punter. Like, with all due respect, like, I think he fits, and I think he will at least get a shot in the booth. I think Shane Gillis. I think Shane Gillis would be good in the booth. I think Shane.
I didn't
Gillis
even think of like sports adjacent.
Yeah,
entertainers. That's a good direction for it.
So that's my answer is Shane Gillis. But I do agree with this idea of analysts who aren't ex-players becoming a thing. We have that here in Cleveland with the Browns. Our radio broadcast, Doug Deacon, who was a legendary offensive lineman, longtime radio analyst, he retired a couple of years ago, and they promoted the sideline reporter, Nathan Zagura, whose background is in fantasy football. And he paired with Jim Donovan, who's our legendary play-by-play guy. And like, they actually like are a really good team and have a lot of chemistry. And Nathan does a good job of not stepping on Jim, but also adding excitement and analysis. So like the idea of like Mina Kimes or Peter Schrager doing that, like on a bigger stage than preseason games, I do not think is far-fetched. But yeah, like I'm going to shoot big here. I think like Shane Gillis, whether it's like, he could definitely do college football. That's probably what he would do. But I think it would have to be somebody like that who's like clearly a sports fan, but would add a unique slant to the broadcasts.
I'm sure somebody's called Kevin Hart about this already.
Yeah.
Somebody's talked to him. That man works so much and already does so much sports adjacent stuff, whether that's the Ice Bath podcast that he does or the alt casts for ESPN for the NBA playoffs or the roast of Brady, all that stuff. Like, somebody's called him. Maybe he'll be the guy.
Well, altcasts kind of murdered this, right? Like altcasts, now guys just go do altcasts.
But those are mostly bad. So I guess so then like just kill that idea and bring them onto the real thing. And I do think one of the conclusions I came to in the piece is like, it probably has to be a 3-person situation. Like Shane Gillis and Mike Tirico, that can't be.
No, that doesn't work for you.
No. But as like a kind of a foil, the way that Kornheiser was, I do think it could make some sense as long as the person is game for it. And what's funny is Peyton Manning, who's like the most coveted broadcaster, free agent maybe ever, and as an empire that he built himself and didn't even go the traditional route, he thought Mina Kimes was worthy of this because he auditioned her to be a host of the Manning cast before deciding, actually, I'll just go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
But like, if he thinks that that's in the terms of what these other networks should be thinking, I'm probably going to trust Peyton Manning, considering he kind of rules ESPN in 2024 on the football side and beyond. So yeah, I hope somebody thinks it up. It's just, there's so many former athletes and coaches. There's no shortage of options. I think that's maybe why we've never really seen it go there, is you're not hurting for another famous quarterback to try out. Not going to make you go to the star of Netflix's Tires, So, all right. But that'll wrap us up for the week. Appreciate you listening. Hit subscribe or follow wherever you're listening to the play-by-play. We're also on YouTube on the Awful Announcing channel, so go hit subscribe there. Read us on awfulannouncing.com. We have a newsletter. We're all across social media on X, Instagram, and beyond. And we'll be back next week.
Thanks for listening.